Anyone vaguely familiar with his works may expect, Edgar Allan Poe lived an unconventional life from the very beginning. His parents, a tuberculosis-ridden mother and a flighty father, worked for an acting company in Boston until his father abandoned the family and TB robbed the young boy of a loved one for the first time. Poe had two siblings, a brother and a sister, from whom he was separated when their family fell apart and Edgar was taken in by the Allan family. The Allans lived in Richmond, Virginia. John and Frances Valentine Allan never officially adopted Edgar, but they fostered him until early adulthood with the intention of conditioning the young boy to follow in John's footsteps and become a tobacco merchant. Wealth and stinginess characterized the successful couple, making the Allan mansion more house than home to their foster son, whose ambitions never included the tobacco business. A high-quality education and John's stern instruction failed to redirect Edgar's literary passions to a more suitable, lucrative career, so tensions between them blossomed as Edgar grew. Perhaps for this reason, Allan sent Poe to his first term at the University of Virginia in 1826 drastically underfunded, forcing Edgar to resort to desperate measures to find financial stability. He failed, amassing significant gambling debt in an attempt to fund his education, and became so desperate that at one point he burned his furniture for warmth. One academically successful but financially disastrous term later, Poe returned to Richmond in 1826 to find a hostile home with the Allans and his fiancée, Elmira Royster, engaged to another man. Poe was left single, estranged from his family, and destitute. It was time for a drastic change. Edgar left the Allan mansion to join the U.S. Army and began his writing career in 1827. He published Tamerlane, his first book, at age 18, though it did not draw much attention. All the while, he moved up Army ranks quickly, becoming sergeant major before gaining admission to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His second book had become slightly more popular than the first by the time his financial troubles disrupted his life once again. John Allan refused to either provide sufficient funding for Edgar to remain a cadet at West Point or offer his consent for Edgar to resign. Little time passed before neglected duties and violations got Edgar thrown out. Running out of options, Poe did what he does best, write and adapt. He published a third book titled Poems in 1831 and moved to Baltimore, the home of his late father. Over the next 10 years, Poe's writing ventures were surprisingly successful, but not very profitable. He gained employment at 7 journals and magazines in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York, including the Saturday Courier. Poe quickly gained a reputation as a ruthless literary critic and a revolutionary Gothic horror writer. At this point, he was best known for his fear-inducing short stories and his fearless attacks of not only writing, but writers themselves. His growing list of literary enemies made him infamous. Almost immediately after West Point, Poe moved to Baltimore to find work and seek help from his late father's extended family. After a turbulent transition, which included being robbed by a relative, Poe found refuge in his Aunt Maria Clem's house. He befriended and quickly fell for Clem's daughter Virginia and began a romantic relationship with his 13-year-old cousin. By the time she had turned 14, the happy couple had gotten married. Poe's victory in the Saturday Courier short story competition awarded him networking opportunities that led to his eventual editorial position at the Southern Liberty Messenger. The Messenger was based in Richmond, so Edgar, Maria, and Virginia packed up and moved south. It was 1835 at this point, and at the age of 26, Poe turned the Messenger into the most popular literary magazine in the South. Despite this, he could hardly afford basic necessities. Edgar had written several well-known short stories at this time, but alcoholism and insufficient compensation kept Poe in poverty. His foster father had died the year before and left Poe out of the will completely, though he had left money to an illegitimate child, so any chance that he may find financial help among family was long gone. Edgar began championing efforts to introduce an international copyright law and gain higher wages for writers, but he remained poor his entire life. When he realized he had gotten all he could, financially and otherwise, out of the Southern Liberty Messenger, he quit and moved back north, where he traveled between New York and Philadelphia. In 1839, he wrote The Fall of the House of Usher, one of his most famous short stories to this day. While others at the time were writing straightforward, realistic, almost journalistic portrayals of traditional American life, Poe plumbed the depths of his readers' fears and desires. He was particularly fascinated by the subconscious and the supernatural. Though his writing was becoming progressively more popular, he was not able to leverage that fame to gain his own journal or magazine, which was his dream. He tried to start one upon his return to New York, but could not gather the funds to do so. He published his first book of short stories in 1840, titled Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, and was only paid in 25 copies of the collection. Poe finally earned higher wages following his release of his most popular poem, The Raven, in 1845. Even so, he was a 36-year-old man working 14-hour days and still could not make a decent living. That was a busy year for Poe, who published 2 books and went on several lecture tours, saving every penny he could. He finally lived out his dream of owning his own journal when he bought the Broadway Journal. Just 1 year later, that happy time came to an end. Rumors of adultery, the failure of the Broadway Journal, and his wife's deteriorating health persuaded Poe to leave the city and move to a cottage in the country in 1846. Virginia had contracted tuberculosis, the same disease that killed Poe's mother. Her illness progressed quickly, and she teetered on the edge of death until January of 1847, when she finally passed. This came as both a terrible blow and an ironic relief to Poe, who said in a letter, "It was the horrible, never-ending oscillations between hope and despair which I could not longer have endured without the total loss of reason." After several months of seclusion, depression, and writer's block following his wife's death, the 38-year-old author emerged from his solitary cottage. He reconnected with his childhood sweetheart and first fiancée, Elmira Royster, whose spouse had also passed away. They got engaged once again and planned to marry after a quick lecture tour through New York and Philadelphia to make some money. Poe stopped in Baltimore on his way to complete the tour. On Wednesday, October 3, 1849, during a minor election in Baltimore, Joseph Walker of the Baltimore Sun found a semi-conscious man wearing torn, ill-fitting clothes lying on the street. Walker identified this man, despite his appearance, as Poe. Dr. J.D. Snodgrass was called upon. Snodgrass and Walker suspected that Poe was just in a drunken stupor, nothing too serious. Another doctor, Dr. John J. Moran, had assisted Snodgrass in examining Poe. Moran and Snodgrass soon realized that he was not inebriated, but could be suffering from a serious illness. Both doctors were anxious to get in touch with a relative of Poe's to get an idea of what illnesses ran in the family, and if Poe was afflicted with any such diseases. Poe awoke hours later, delirious and incoherent. Moran called on him as he lay in bed, saying, "Wife, wife?" There was Sis, Virginia. But Sissy was dead. She had been dying since the Red Death covered all her hopes years before. She had died 1,000 times, the child, and becoming a woman only at the last. Yet, Elmira. After this came cries of remorse for the next 3 days as his delirium became more violent. On Saturday, October 6th, Poe cried out, "Reynolds, oh Reynolds!" Then it was 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, October 7th, when Poe took his last breath.